IVM.
Before we move on with this episode of The Seen and the Unseen, do check out another awesome podcast from IVM Podcast, Cyrus Says, hosted by my old buddy Cyrus Brocha. The 2019 general elections are upon us, and it's a good time to ask, what do our political parties believe in? Most parties espouse principles only as a matter of positioning in the political marketplace. They will say anything and do anything that gets them votes. They are immoral and sociopathic. You vote for them on the basis of what you want in that political marketplace and how credibly they can deliver that. But there is one political party in India that is clearly different. The BJP does seem to have certain core beliefs, and because they are the biggest political player around, and because beliefs have consequences, it is worth examining their philosophy. What is this Hindutva thing? What is this Hindu Rashtra that so many people aspire to? What does it mean for our nation that the BJP's idea of India is so exclusionary, so full of resentments from the past, so dependent on identity? And most importantly, what are its intellectual foundations?
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Aakar Patel, a journalist and columnist whose work I have been reading since the 1990s, who is often provocative, usually insightful, and always worth reading. I asked Aakar to come on the show as a guest in the expectation of nothing other than a stimulating conversation, and I didn't have a subject in mind for him. Then Aakar mentioned that he's writing a book called Our Hindu Rashtra, which will be released by Westland later this year. It made perfect sense to talk about that, especially with these ongoing elections, to take a closer look at what is fast becoming an idea of India that has gained immense traction in the last few years. What is Hindutva exactly? Why has it become so popular recently? What are its intellectual foundations? I got the stimulating conversation I wanted, and you're invited to listen in. But first, a quick commercial break. This episode of The Seen and the Unseen is brought to you by Storytel. Storytel is an audiobook platform which you can listen to on your Android or iOS app. They have thousands of audiobooks that you can listen to on your mobile, including hundreds in local languages like Hindi and Marathi. An unlimited monthly subscription costs only Rs $2.99 per month. And you can also get a 30-day free trial if you hop on over to storytel.com/IVM. I actually use Storytel myself regularly, so as long as they sponsor the show, I'm going to recommend one book a week that I love. My recommendation today is a book I finished reading a month ago called Atomic Habits by James Clear. I have a huge problem of discipline. My mind keeps wandering. I crave the dopamine rush of social media. I never seem to get anything done. But Atomic Habits has some great insights on how the brain works and how we can discipline it, one atomic habit at a time. James Clear also has a great weekly newsletter. But hey, you can hear his book for free on Storytel. And remember, you get a 30-day free trial only at storytel.com/IVM. Aakar, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you.
Aakar, before we get going talking about the book that you're writing and the subject at hand, tell me a little bit about yourself. You've been a journalist right since the early 90s, and now you head Amnesty in India. What's that journey been like?
Sure. I'm from Surat, and I moved to Bombay in 94, at the end of 94, looking for work, and the sort of easiest work one could find with not much qualification was in journalism then. I think the case is the same now. And I worked in newspapers till 2005. I ran a business for a few years after that, and then I retired. And 5 years after that, I got a job in a non-profit, which is where I am now.
And you've kind of been a prolific columnist even now. And, you know, as someone who is also a columnist, one of the things I marvel at is how prolific you are, how many columns you actually get done.
So there is a tradition in the language papers of South Asia, whether they are in Gujarati, Hindi, Marathi, Urdu, where you have somebody who is like an autodidact, not a specialist, and a regular writer. So any newspaper in Pakistan or in Bangladesh or in Surat will have such people who work for newspapers who write 3-4 times a week. So I think I come from that tradition. So writing is easy and it gets easier when you do it more and more.
And you had a deep interest in Urdu also. I believe you started learning it in the 1990s. You've written a lot about it. Tell me about that interest and how it's kind of...
I worked in a newspaper that also had a Urdu edition, which sort of fascinated me. And I thought I should try and learn the script. And then a series of Maulvis came home. This was in early 2000. And they taught me how to read it. And at some point, I figured out that this was just the Hindi that I knew from Bollywood, written a different way. So the mystery and the romance left at that point. But I knew the language sufficiently to be able to do some basic translations. And I did that, yeah.
And you also translated Manto's works, in fact.
Yes, so he's quite an interesting writer. He was autodidactic himself, didn't pass out of college, and wrote very simply. I think he wrote the kind of language that you and I would recognize as being Hindi. He would call it Urdu. So it wasn't that difficult. The Perso-Arabic content, which tends to define Urdu in our time, was fairly low in his writing.
In fact, just this issue itself about how there was this common sort of bhasha called Hindustani, and then out of that you had this movement to separate Urdu and Hindi, and then, it also speaks to a bit about what we're talking about today, doesn't it? Is that part of the nationalism project?
Indeed. I think you're dead right. I think both with the movement that happened in the heartland, Bharatiya Harishchandra and so on in the 19th century, and whatever happened with Urdu after 1947 in Pakistan and here, is part of that narrative that you try to hold on to your nationalism through the script, and the language then changes. Pakistanis that I know think that Bollywood is actually their language, Urdu. And when I ask them what they think Hindi is, they would say something like, it's what Vajpayee ji speaks, whereas we would listen to Jio TV or one of the Pakistani stations, and it would not be that easy for us to pick it out. I think the vocabulary has changed a bit across the border. The grammar, of course, remains the same.
And one of the things that I can't often figure out is that when Modi gives many of his speeches, like his addresses to the nation, and he chooses to speak in Hindi, he's not actually speaking in the regular colloquial Hindi in which you and I might converse, but a Shuddh form of it, using those Shuddh Hindi terms. And I've always wondered that if he is trying to spread his thing as a national leader, isn't that strategically unwise, or does that in itself imply some kind of message and positioning?
That's a good question. I think there are many Hindis, and I think the one that he uses, I would say, is less stripped of what we would call Hindustani than a lot of other people. I think Vajpayee ji wrote a much more Sanskritized form of the language. Mr. Modi comes out of a tradition where in Gujarati, it's been a language which has had access to Arabic and Farsi for a very long time. And the modern Gujarati vocabulary is not dependent on, for instance, English to be able to have sophisticated communication in commerce. So we have words like, say, hundi or hawala, which are bad words otherwise outside of Gujarat. But for a Gujarati, they would purely be, these are both words from Arabia, would just be purely words that would represent transactions. So I think he would be using a lot of Farsi words. We call a door a darwajo, which is actually a Persian word, a darwaza, and so on. So I don't think that it's as stripped as Mr. Vajpayee's was. But it is, as you say, fairly Sanskritized in many ways.
Like just a use of the word mitro, and I could be wrong here, but it seems to me that mitro is not something people would use in normal conversation. They'd say dosto or yaro or whatever.
Yeah, he has a bit of a style to him. So I think he's quite studied in the way that he approaches his public image quite seriously. And he would have given a great deal of thought to how to present himself and what should the catchphrases be. He's the kind of guy who spends a lot of time thinking about this.
So before we kind of get to your book, we are recording this on March 28th. The episode comes out on April 8th. What do you think is going to happen in these elections? What's your...
My sense is that we'll have a hung parliament. And my sense is that it'll be more hung than people think it's going to be. And I think that's a good thing. I think that the more parties that have access to the pie in Delhi, the more levers you have for civil society us, NGO walas, we don't have that much to hold on to when there is a single party that rules Delhi. There's absolutely nobody that listens to you, particularly on the difficult subjects. And I think that the more divided the share of power is, the better it is for this country, the more voices are heard, the deeper the representation. So my hope, at least, if not my studied sort of, analysis, is that there will be a hung parliament, and it will be more hung than people think it will be.
No, and it's a great thing for another reason, in the sense that you automatically then have more checks and balances, and at a time when institutions are being eroded anyway, that, might be useful.
Well, the counter to what you're saying, and I completely agree with you, but the counter to what you're saying might well be the fact that, okay, look at, say, UP at 2, when you have a weak center and when you don't have a central figure of authority, then the periphery and the ministries do, whatever they want to. And so it's sort of, double-edged. But I, on the whole, think that South Asia generally is better off when power at the center is split and it's not unified in the form of either a person, definitely not in the form of a person, or a party.
So let's talk about your book now. Your book is about the Hindu Rashtra, right? And you've been writing about this for donkey's years. What made you interested in the subject? I mean, over time, how have your thoughts on this evolved?
Coming from Surat, I had this sort of traditional middle-class upbringing, very Hindu, where the access to diversity was fairly low. You did have, say, Muslims in your class, but because it was a school that was middle class and English, there wasn't as much representation of the society that you would be in. And once you left school, Surat's fairly ghettoized, so it's a very old city. The Brits came there in 1608, but it was already a big city then. Tolstoy wrote a short story called The Coffeehouse of Surat, where he says that a lot of people from around the world, Chinese people and Armenians and all, gather and talk about life. And it's true that it was a port city till the 18th century.
So it was both globalized and ghettoized.
It was both globalized and ghettoized. Very, very true. It had access because of its port. It has a very sheltered port, or it did actually. Now it's silted over. But the port is inland from the sea. So you could have fairly large ships come into the Arabian Sea and then come into Surat, but then be on a river, the Tapi, which cuts India in half, east to west. And so it had access to the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English and so on, much before the rest of India did. It was the primary port of the Mughal Empire. So it was where Hajj left from. And it was this city, and is this city, which was segregated in terms of caste. So you had something called a sheri, which is a lane with a single mouth, and you've got homes on both sides, sharing walls of one caste. So my mum grew up in a place called Sidmatani Sheri, which is the neighborhood of this goddess called Siddhamata, and it was full of patidar homes. So when I go back to Surat, a lot of the neighbors there are still from the same caste, and it's sort of remained that way.
And how did that shape the young man you
were? One big difference between me and a lot of the other people from my background was the fact that I went to a school there where I was taught English. So Surat at that point had 4 schools. It was a city of about 25 or 30 lakh people, but there were only 4 schools that taught English. 3 of them set up by the missionaries and 1 by the Parsis. Hindus, who were 90% of the school's population, had not built a single one. But that access to the language gave one access then to books. There was one bookstore in Surat then, like a very large city. But whatever I could get my hands on, I would read. And that sort of opened up the world in a way that would not have had I been like the rest of my cousins and so on, not in an English school.
And how was it that, was there a time when you began to feel that you were apart from them in the way you looked at the world? Because I'm assuming that in that kind of background, if you grow up, you are pretty much someone who is going to grow up a Modi supporter, for example.
Yeah, so the BJP has become the party of Hindus in that state. That's why we see very remarkable things like a vote share of more than 50%, which is very unusual in democratic politics anywhere, but particularly in this country. Because what happens usually in our country is that you've got two dominant castes. Let's say in Karnataka, we are in Bangalore now. You've got the Vokkaliga and you've got the Lingayat. So there would be a kind of a primary war over who would get access to the state and the goodies that the state gives. So it's usually that way. What's happened in Gujarat is that though it started out that way, where the division was basically the Patidar community supporting the BJP, which it does still, the majority of all BJP cabinets that have been formed in that state since 95 have comprised of the Patel community. And the other community was the Neo-Kshatriya, or what is called Thakur, Darbar, these words, which went to the Congress. But what has happened is that the split is not even. Seats that are reserved, for instance, for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes tend to go to the BJP entirely. And the Congress has stayed there in almost permanent opposition. I'm 49 years old. I came into the age of voting in 1988. Every single Lok Sabha election that I have been old enough to vote for there has been won by one BJP man. Of course, he was denied a ticket after Mr. Modi came to power. But Kashiram Rana was the guy who represented Surat. And from being somebody who was 18 or 19 to somebody who was in his 40s, to have the same person represent them, it's very unusual for a city especially. But that's how Gujarat has come to be.
And as a young journalist, I mean, if you sort of look at the arc of your career, at the start of your career, the Hindutva or the Hindu Rashtra or whatever was just about exploding with Babri and all of that. And now it's kind of taken over the country in a sense. What was your approach to it then? And, did you see this coming?
No, I didn't. And it was like an episode then. It seemed like something which was extraordinary, which was behind us. And I wasn't old enough or sort of mature enough, certainly, to be able to understand what it had done, what that moment meant. I had celebrated the night when the mosque was torn down. I was with some friends and it seemed like a very big moment, that something big had happened.
You celebrated?
I was excited. I mean, I don't know if the word is celebrate, but I was sort of... I wouldn't say that I was disappointed. I wasn't sad or like anything else. That's the background that one grew up in. The Muslims were the them and we were the we. And then we had done something big. And then... but no, in the mid-90s, it had not occurred to me that an event was not just one moment, but it was something that would live with us for a long time.
So, sort of two related questions, I guess. When did you start to realize that it was a process and it was becoming something? And when did you also start to change from a position of looking at the world through that we or them thing?
I think moving to Bombay, it was still called Bombay when I moved, did some of that. That you had access to people who were much smarter than you. And in the newsroom in those days, that was fairly sort of easy to come by. Very bright people came to work for very little money. People who were much better read than you. And you worked with women. I'd never worked with a woman before in my life. And this sort of opens up your eyes if you are in any way open-minded, in a way that very few things will, because in a very brief period of time, you are exposed to people who are smarter than you, who come from a different background, who might be from a gender that you didn't think as being, belonging in the workplace. So you have an education drilled into you fairly quickly. So I think by the mid-90s, I was there. I also encountered some people whose writing stayed with me for a very long time. And
like who?
There's a man called Khalid Ahmad who writes for the Express here in India. He's a Lahori. He's a former diplomat in the Pakistani Foreign Service, a former newspaper editor, both in Urdu in English. He wrote for a paper called The Frontier Post in Zia's period. So that was not an easy time for journalists, definitely not for somebody who was a proper intellectual, which he is. And he was bilingual. So I think that really attracted me to him. What we have on the subcontinent generally, and in this country in particular, is that the intellectual narrative belongs to a group of people who are more or less monolingual, that they can read in their own language, but they do not regularly read in it, and they certainly don't write it. He was different in that sense, so he brought a perspective which was quite unique, and I would recommend to those people who are sort of listening to this to try and find some of his stuff.
Khalid Ahmed. So how did you again come to the subject of the book, The Hindu Rashtra?
So I think we are living with it. I think what happened in Gujarat in 2002, and I was there then. I'd gone back to that state with a group of people that were doing a study. And at that point, it sort of occurred to me that this was not something that we should treat as being episodic, that we had a riot in 69, and then we had a riot in 84, and then we had a riot in 93, and then so on. This was something different, and this was going to stay with us for a very long time. And it began then, I think. And then I started reading some of the stuff that was that underpins the BJP and the RSS. I read the stuff that the Prime Minister wrote. And so it didn't occur to me that there was a book in it. But I think the last 4.5 years, I think, solidified the idea that there is something that is compact that can be written and explained to people.
And one of the things that sort of struck me when we fixed up the time for this episode, and I thought I should prep for it, and I tried to look for books on the subject of Hindutva and the intellectual traditions behind it, and discovered a paucity of such material. There's just practically no
yeah, there's not much there, unfortunately. So if you look at the subcontinent, if you look at religious conservatism, almost all of it at the properly intellectual level is Muslim. So if we think of radical Islamist groups, Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood, their thinking is underpinned by a man who came out of Maharashtra. It wasn't called that then. Aurangabad, a man called Maududi, self-taught, but smart enough to look at the modern world and build a structure that responded to the modern world from the perspective of his faith. We didn't have that happen from the Hindu thinkers. So that's true, that that radicalism and response to modernity from the perspective of a faith that holds on to itself as being true did not come to the Hindus of the subcontinent as much as it came to the Muslims. And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, so, through the course of this episode, we're going to talk about, the three of the foundational thinkers who you're going to write about in your book as well. You are writing about in your book as well. Savarkar, Golwalkar and Deendayal, Upadhyay. But before that, just place all of this in context for me. Like, you could say that in a sense, India is the only part of South Asia which doesn't have something like a Hindu Rashtra.
Yeah, you're right. So all the states that comprise South Asia, except for India, are in some way a majoritarian. So Afghanistan, Pakistan chose to have Islamic constitutions. So did the Maldives. In Lanka, Buddhism is a privilege according to the constitution. Bangladesh was part, obviously, of the Pakistan movement, but its foundational direction was secular. So it was Bengali nationalism rather than anything else. But when they became independent, they put Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim on top of their constitution, which was then removed by the court. But all the nations have dabbled in it in some way. Bhutan has a king who can only come from a particular faith, and he controls both the physical apparatus of the state as well as the spiritual one. Nepal used to be what is called the Hindu Rashtra till 2008. Though, of course, it was limited in the sense that you cannot have a Hindu Rashtra, and that's what my book is also about. It's not physically possible. But all of these states at some point assumed that they should be in some way a majoritarian, except for the largest country in South Asia. So we started off as being unique, and we've remained unique, I think, both for reasons that were positive in nature, that the people who were writing the laws and the constitution felt it should be that way, and by default, that there is no real option for us to become majoritarian.
And it's interesting that you say that we remain that in two ways. One by, the elites who framed the constitution, obviously, and the other by default, because, one of the thinkers, you're writing a book about Deendayal Upadhyay, often complained, and I chatted about this in a previous episode with Shashi Tharoor, and Upadhyay used to complain that our constitution is, again, it's been imposed on us by a bunch of elites, and it doesn't reflect the real India, therefore perhaps implying that we need a constitution that actually does. And and when we sort of think about the last 70 years, obviously elites write constitutions everywhere. Elites run policy and they design the country. But it seems that at some sense what we see in the last 5 years is also that there is a sense of reassertion by people who are saying that, no, this is the real India and you elites have it wrong and you're completely irrelevant. And obviously a side note to that is all the ranting that goes on against the elites and how the word liberal has become a pejorative and so on. But what do you feel about something that I consider a paradox, being a liberal of sorts myself, that you had a bunch of liberal elites imposing a liberal constitution on an illiberal country? So how can that imposition be liberal in itself?
I think it's a very good question. So there are two parts to it. One is the assumption made by people like Upadhyay and others that in some way the constitution represents values that are foreign or that are alien. I haven't ever found a response to what else it should be. Okay, I accept the fact that the Constituent Assembly of India is basically the Congress party debating itself. There's no particularly strong representation from what we would consider to be conservative upper caste elements exerting that sort of, conservatism from the Hindu faith. But if there were, what would they do? The problem with the majoritarian Hindutva aspect is that unlike Islam, where you can have a majoritarian constitution that discriminates against minorities, and you do have that in a lot of places, including in Pakistan. Problem with a Hindutva constitution, the way that I have understood it based on what I've read, is that it will discriminate against most Hindus. If we look at the caste system, there are two things that any state can do when it decides to be a majoritarian from the faith perspective. One is that it tries to impose the articles of its faith. The other is that it discriminates. We've got the latter. And we've had it for a long time. I don't think that it's the BJP that has done bad things by itself, and the people that came before it were in some way different. They were different in minor ways, but I think that for the most part, it's not that we were going through a kind of halcyon phase and then it's suddenly become hell. That's not the way that I see it. The problem is on the other side. Pakistan can say through its constitution, and it has, that no non-Muslim can become the president. And they can't, because that's what the law says. How is it that we are going to impose the Hindu faith on a population that's 85% Hindu, where you've got a third of that population is Dalit and Adivasi. About 50% is from the community I come from, which is Shudra, based on the Smritis.
As is Modi himself.
Imposing the articles of faith would lead to wholesale discrimination against the majority of Hindus. And so it's not physically possible for us to have Hindu Rashtra in this country?
I think if I may take a stab at answering the rhetorical question, one of the things that our constitution aims to do and doesn't do well enough, in my opinion, in the sense that it's not liberal enough, therefore, is focus on protecting individual rights, which it doesn't do completely enough, but it does to enough of an extent that you can call it a liberal constitution. And, as you pointed out in the notes that you sent me from your book about this, that this was something specifically that, not in the context of the constitution, but in terms of what a Hindu Rashtra should look like, that Golwalkar felt that there should be no focus on individual rights at all, that the collective took precedence over the individual. So if I would imagine a Hindutva constitution, and obviously I can't because I don't have the kind of knowledge that you do, but if I were to imagine it, I imagine one of the things that it would not do, which the current constitution does partially, is protect individual rights.
Maybe that's a good way of looking at it, that you would have a collective rights. But what would that look like in law?
Right.
Would we always act in concert as a mob in terms of, would we never have a disagreement within that specific schism that we would have, whether it would be Vaishnavas or, whatever else?
I guess we'd have far lesser protections for women, for example, to start with.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what we are living through, that you're living through a default Hindu Rashtra that discriminates against, say, women going to temple because they are seen as, impure in some way. In terms of a practice, but that runs into law, and then law says, I'm sorry, but if you have a constitution that says equality, and I think we have a pretty mediocre set of judges in our Supreme Court, but even there, I think you would find that when the practice of sort of Hindu Rashtra runs into the constitution, the response is usually incoherent, that it is not able to express itself because the discrimination is underneath rather than completely externalized like it is in Islam.
And one of the things that you said when we were chatting about this episode was that we need to, if you're talking about the Hindu Rashtra, we also need to talk about the Pakistan project and what happened there and how that played out as an example of a majoritarian sort of state, our immediate neighbor. And I mean, we are practically the same country until recently. Tell me a little bit about that.
Pakistan can be seen in a few different ways. So I think the one thing that I came to learn pretty late in life was that the partition of India was basically the partition of just two states, Bengal and Punjab. And in on the west, the transfer of citizens was almost absolute. So very few non-Muslims remaining in West Punjab, very few Muslims remaining in East Punjab. Secondly, and I know this because of the work done by the amateur sociologists and ethnographers that the Raj brought with it, who were really interested in communities and they would document stuff. What happened in Punjab was that the conversion of the primary mercantile castes, there were two of them, Khatri and Amaroda, other than the Baniyas who were very small, did not happen outside of Sikhism. So 99.9% of the people from these two communities remained Hindu or they were Sikh. The 10 Sikh gurus were Khatris. Partition on that front was a partition also of castes because of this, that you had a fairly talented set of merchants who all moved after 47. And you had, on the other hand, a very hardworking set of Jats who had been given access by the British to the army. They, after the mutiny, they were the bulwark of the British Indian Army. And they had been given lands and so on. So you've got this fairly martial population in charge of a large part of Pakistan, more than 50% of what is today Pakistan, and what used to be West Pakistan is Punjabi speaking. So you had a dominant martial caste there in charge of the population without the leavening of the mercantilism of the Khatris and the Aroda Punjabis. To my mind, that had a significant effect in the way that the country evolved and has continued to evolve. I think the militaristic spirit that it shows, the love of the army despite being ruled by it for most of its post-1947 period, speaks to that. I think there is something about, there's some romance to the way that they view the military. The Pakistan project, I think, collapsed from the modernist point of view with the death of Jinnah. In his person, there was still some hope that they were going to some kind of Turkey-type state, which would... So Turkey in the 20s romanized the alphabet, banned the fairs, and so that was seen as a sign of modernity, and they wore suits and they had guns and so on. And Jinnah was quite sort of enamored of Ataturk. He's named only 2 books that he's read. I translated a very short interview he did in Gujarati in the 1920s. And the 2 books that he's read, one is The Count of Monte Cristo, and the other is a book called Grey Wolf by this man called H.C. Armstrong, who had profiled Kemal Ataturk.
Were these his favorite books, or do you think they were the...
I don't think he was well read. He's a beautiful writer. I wish I hadn't spent as much money on the Jinnah papers as I have, because they're rubbish. But the way that he spoke and wrote is manifestly superior to what people of my generation who've studied English, and we are not there. He spoke and wrote it really well. He had a sort of felicity for the language.
And he was an accomplished lawyer and all of that.
He was a very good advocate. He was not a particularly good lawyer. And I think the difference in that is that he was very good at taking a brief and then being able to represent it before a judge, rather than doing the hard work of finding the details out and so on. So he was seen as a phenomenal advocate, but not that good a lawyer. So he dies a few months after partition, as does Gandhi. And in the weeks up to partition, Jinnah has made statements that suggest that the Constitution of Pakistan, he's careful to say that it is the work of the Constituent Assembly and not his own work. But he says enough to suggest that it would have some sort of alignment with the faith. Then, just 4 days before partition, he gives a speech he speaks to the Constituent Assembly, where he says things like, in a post-independence Pakistan, Hindus will be free to go to their temples and so on. And he says that the state is not likely at some point in the future to look on citizens through the prism of faith, that they will just be Pakistanis. So that suggested to people later that he was trying to speak of a secular state, but he never used that word, secular. And he left enough sort of evidence here and there for us to assume that he would be okay with the way that the Pakistani constitutions, I should say, they have 3 of them, turned out. But he dies. He's got TB just before a partition. His doctor, who's a Parsi man from Bombay, doesn't tell anybody. And 6 months after he dies, the Pakistani Constituent Assembly, which has a fairly large composition of Bengali Hindus from East Pakistan, they start their discussions on what the constitution should be. And Liaquat Ali Khan, who's this North Indian kind of royalty type figure, Sunni. Jinnah was a Gujarati from a very small community called the Sevener Shia, the Khojas, and he had actually converted out of it at one point. Liaquat proposed something called the Objectives Resolution, which was a sort of a preamble. And Pakistan, according to that preamble, would be an Islamic state where sovereignty belonged to Allah, but it would be given in trust to the people of Pakistan. And you would have democracy, you would have freedom, you would have tolerance, you would have justice, you would have all of that. But you would have all of these as enunciated by Islam. And this naturally alarmed the Hindus in the Pakistani Constituent Assembly. And there's a series of very learned interventions that they made. And it's worth reading them. And I hope to reproduce much of that in my book, saying that this was not what Jinnah had promised, that this was vague. They were going into a space which no other nation had gone through before. Pakistan and Israel pretty much at the same time determined that they're going to be states that have a faith-based component in the constitution. So Jewish state there, and you've got the Muslim state here. But these words, as enunciated by Islam, didn't really mean much specifically. Islam itself broke into two right at the beginning, not because of a theological dispute, but because of a political dispute, who should succeed the Prophet. And so there was no real means of saying what Islamic democracy was, what was Islamic equality. Being a desert people, they had the primary form of asset with the family was actually cattle, easy to divide. And so at a time in the world 1400 years ago, when women did not have much by way of rights, the Prophet of Islam said that a daughter should inherit 1/2 of what the son gets. And this was great for that time, but you can't have the same law after 1400 years. What happened was, in the interpretations that they gave these very basic sentences, Pakistan applied them across law. So Pakistan started off, and it still has the same IPC that we do. So they know what 420 means, for example. They know what 153A means.
Or 124A sedition is
all of it. It's right there. They've tweaked some of the punishments to make them harsher, especially for a blasphemy in the 80s. But so they started off with the same laws, but they thought that they should Islamize the state in some way. And one way of doing that was to try and use precepts and use some statements from 1400 years ago and try and apply them to the modern world, which doesn't work. So they had this constitution that came out in the 50s. Almost immediately, the army took over and kept power for a decade. The army had its own constitution. The army was tough on East Pakistan. Jinnah wanted to impose Urdu on the whole. He didn't speak it himself, couldn't read it. He spoke Gujarati, and he spoke it really well. I've translated that interview that I told you about. His writing is really polished, and he knows the language. I mean, and I'm sure, being in South Bombay, the toff that he was, that would have been the primary language even in court for many decades after a partition. If you look at lawyers like Chagla or whoever else, a lot of the heavyweights in the Indian judiciary were Parsis, Muslims, Hindus who came out of the Bombay High Court. So they tried to adapt to a modern constitution things that they believe they should be doing out of a sense of piety. Nobody's doing this to persecute people. The fact is that when they wrote the objectives resolution, the Muslims were probably confident that they were not going to produce a state that was going to in any way discriminate. But that is what it did. And they were never happy with it. The problem is with a utopian state or a constitution that aims to take you to a state that is in some way a utopia. It never works. So Pakistan had to go through one constitution in the 50s, another one in the 60s. The country broke. I was talking about Jinnah wanting to impose this language on the Bangladeshis, which they didn't want. There were
more of them, in fact.
There were more of them. And if things remain the way they are, for the first time in the history of the subcontinent, in 2 or 3 years, the Bangladesh per capita income will outstrip that of Pakistan, which is remarkable for a country that was thought to be a basket case only 40 years ago. So Bangladesh secedes with help from India, and the country breaks up, and there's a third constitution, 1973, written by the PPP under Bhutto, and that's the one that's remained in some form today. But over time, the discrimination has been written in. So you've got, for example, no president or prime minister can be a non-Muslim. You've got the law on property. Ziaul Haq comes and extends that to rape. So a woman's testimony is seen to be worth only half a man's. And if a man is accused of rape by a woman, she must produce 2 male witnesses to the act of rape. And if she cannot do that, she's accused of fornication and jailed. And this is what actually happened. No party was able to escape it once it came on to the books. Once you had a written constitution that demanded that the faith be in some way imposed so that people could benefit from the blessings of living in a faithful country. It didn't stop. The PPP was a liberal socialist party. They are the ones that changed the constitution in 1974. Bhutto apostatized this community called the Ahmadis. And even today, Pakistani passport holders must in writing disown membership of that community.
Why did he do that?
There was a riot in the 50s. This is a community that comes out of Punjab. There are many of them here in India as well. So we think of Islam in India as being sort of very monotheistic, but it's not really that. There's lots of saints. Just like Saint Paul came and converted the polytheistic Romans into Christians by giving them saints. You could go and worship whoever you wanted to, but you would now call them a saint, and they would be a sort of intercessor between you and God. Islam's done the same thing. More people pray at shrines in Lahore or in Ajmer than have ever gone to Mecca. And that's the way it is. That is the subcontinent's faith. It's very powerfully colored with mysticism and the power of dead people. So one of these sects in Punjab, one of these men has visions. And Islam has been quite firm in its belief that Muhammad is the last of the line of prophets that starts with Adam, that he's the first and he's the last. And anyone having visions then becomes a sort of threat. And therefore, there was a problem with the it's a fairly recent community. It's not that old. Late 19th century, I think. There were some riots in Pakistani Punjab in the 50s on the same issue. And then rather than surrender the street to mobs that wanted violence on this, Bhutto just sort of did the easy thing and rewrote the law. That's happened in a lot of places with the blasphemy law. So, as I said, Pakistan's got exactly the same set of laws that we have, written by Macaulay in the 1860s. And blasphemy was punishable by up to 3 years in jail. Almost nobody blasphemed. There were only 8 cases of blasphemy registered before 1980 in India and Pakistan combined. For a law that's like more than 100 years old. So it's not that kind of place. I think the veneration of faith is very high in our parts. So it's very unlikely that you'll find somebody deliberately blaspheming. And the judiciary was quite tolerant. So when you had somebody like Naikar in the south breaking idols of Ganesha in public, it was seen as something that he had the right to do. We can't do it anymore, obviously. In this country. But in Pakistan, what happened was they changed it to death. Immediately, the number of cases of blasphemy, especially against non-Muslims, shot up to over 1,000. It was a tool to be used against people you didn't like for whatever reason. It could be reasons of faith, it could be reasons of property, which it often was. But it gave the law the anger of society. And I think that's what usually happens when you have a majoritarian state in South Asia, that there is an undercurrent and it becomes more powerful and it expresses itself through violence when you turn it into law.
So is the whole Pakistan project a cautionary tale of sorts for those in India who see the spectre of a Hindu Rashtra?
I think so. I think that we ought to look at where majoritarianism took Pakistan, not just from the point of view of the constitution. Like I said, they are on their 3rd constitution or 5th, if you really look at it. The kind of mauling that Zia did in the 80s. And then, you had people like Musharraf, who was there for almost a decade. Nothing good comes of it. The idea that our constitution is in some way foreign or the values that it talks about, equality or secularism or whatever, is foreign, is bogus. And these are not values that are owned by any one nation or any one race.
I mean, my point is, even if they say originated with the Enlightenment and came to us from there, what difference does it make now? Values.
It does make a difference. You know, the Greeks really respected India. Pythagoras, who they credit as being the origin of the 7-note scale in music, and, you know, we are familiar with the theorem, was actually a vegetarian because he came to India and picked it up with him. That's what the Greeks believe. This is not something this is not a Tejo Mahalaya kind of thing. You know, if you read Plato and Socrates and from that period, immense respect for what the East had. And I don't think there is any one moment in history where any one community or nation says that we've, you know, put this up from zero. Democracy is just a word, but I'm saying that if you are going to lead a group of people, there's going to be pushback from that group. They would want a stake in power. That's the way the human being is. We're not the sort of people who can be herded into groups and then told what to do. And so even though it might be seen as an external idea, I don't think it is. I don't think that liberty is, you know, particularly a preserve of the West, and certainly not that of the Enlightenment.
We'll take a quick commercial break and we'll come back to talk about the intellectual gurus of Hindutva, as it were.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast. If you're not following us on social media, please make sure that you do. We're IVM Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So just wanted to make a note for everybody. We do have this new Alexa skill that we've created for Cyrus Says. If you have an Alexa, please say play Cyrus Says, and you should be able to listen to the podcast on the Alexa from now on. Speaking of Cyrus Says, this week Cyrus is joined by Dr. Vishakha Shivdasani. They talk about healthy eating and nutrition, and Vishakha clears Cyrus's confusion about the professions of nutritionists, dietitian, doctors, and health coaches. This week on Geek Fruit, Tejas and Dinkar bring on producer Zoya to discuss Interstellar and the Dark Knight trilogy, and rank the on-screen portrayals of Batman. On the Sponge podcast, Ambi Parmeshwaran talks about what makes for a great client and agency relationship, and how not to get caught in intra-company crossfires. On MF 101, Anupam talks to Manish Dangi, co-CIO Debt at Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund, about debt mutual funds, its characteristics, and current scenarios. We've launched a brand new sports show called What a Player, where the hosts give you insights about the latest games, scores, and strategies. Do check it out for updates about the ongoing T20 Cricket League. New episodes are out every morning. This week on Dating is Garbage, our hosts invite the first couple on the show, Naveen Narona and Abhishek Tundel, to talk about the green flags of dating. On Croc's Tales, Anand Sivakumara narrates tales of friendship, dating, and love, all centered around the phrase Kuch Meetha Ho Jaye. This week on our Kannada podcast, Thale Arate, CV Madhukar discusses how philanthropy and impact investing can make a difference in our society. And with that, let's get on with your show.
Welcome back to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Aakar Patel about his forthcoming book on the Hindu Rashtra, by which I guess in a sense you mean Hindutva. And that's again a term coined by Vinayak Savarkar, you know, the first of the thinkers you focus on.
Yeah, it's a new word. I don't think it occurs in the Smritis. It doesn't occur in the Vedas. There's no reference to it. But the community of people who are Hindutva followers are very possessive about that word. Savarkar definitely was. He was very keen to show that its origins were not in some way Muslim in nature. This might have been a debate when he was writing the book in the 20s. Certainly it's not now. But he felt that the Hindu faith ought to own the word and the etymology of the word from Sindhu and so on. So we don't have any particular references to Hindutva till he writes his book in the 20s. He's a young man at that point. He's in jail. And this is still pre-1947 India. So his concern is not what the relationship of the state is with Hindutva. That is not his concern. I think his primary objective is definition. And he's trying to construct a nation which is whole, which is intact, and which is pure. And he finds that idea in the word Hindu, which to him means two things. It means the land in which the Hindus live, beginning at the Indus and moving east. And secondly, what he calls the faiths that are of this land. So he includes Jainism, he includes Sikhism, includes Buddhism. He excludes Islam, excludes Christianity, but includes atheists who are Hindu. So maybe he hasn't thought it through fully, but there are some contradictions there that remain. But his idea was to develop a theory of nationhood. This is a period when Europe's going through a lot of that sort of thinking itself, and he arrives at this construct, which he calls Hindutva.
And in fact, reading his book, it struck me that more than half of it seemed to be about semantics and about just the term Hindutva and Hinduism and all of that. And it's interesting why he objected to the term Hinduism, which he objects to, which he says that is because, an ism means a body of beliefs, and he wanted a word which would encompass a lot more.
Yeah, you're right. He wanted a word that was bigger than sort of Hinduism. And he comes to the word Hindutva, which he says is a word of common usage, which I find hard to believe because it's not one even now. I mean, I don't know how many people knew the word in the 1920s. But he's probably the best read of the Hindutva writers. He's got access to a British education. He's a multilingual properly. He writes a pretty good English. I think that he would stand out as a writer if he wrote columns today. He has a sense of wordplay, better read, and I think a better thinker than the people who came after him.
Right, and there's an interesting quote from his book about the word Hindu. I'll just read it out. Quote, "The reason that explains why the term Hindu cannot be synonymous with Bharatiya or Hindi, which was used as an epithet in some senses, with synonymous with Bharatiya or Hindi or mean an Indian only, naturally introduces us to the second essential implication of that term. The Hindus are not merely the citizens of the Indian state because they are united not only by the bonds of love they bear to a common motherland, but also by the bonds of a common blood. They are not only a nation, but also a race/jati. The word jati, derived from the root jan, to produce, means a brotherhood, a race determined by a common origin, possessing a common blood. All Hindus claim to have in their veins the blood of the mighty race incorporated with and descended from the Vedic fathers, the Sindhus." Stop quote. And it seemed to me in the book that while defining Hindus and Hindutva, he is relying a lot on his sense of history, which we now know today to be completely false.
Yeah, it would be hard to break it to the old man. What the sort of recent discoveries in
I had an episode recently with Tony Joseph and his great books.
Yeah. No, they didn't know that then. The other thing is that he's writing in the early 20s, and I think it's 1926, if I'm not mistaken, when Mohenjo-daro is discovered. So India doesn't know of the existence of Indus Valley civilization till the mid-20s. And it's in this period that he's writing. So he's coming up, he's full of romance. We are this great culture, but he probably has to wait at the traffic light while the British guy gets access first, and probably excluded from pubs in London. He was in London for a bit. So that would have had played fairly heavily on him. And he's writing with that background. And it should be understood that a sense of grandioseness in what he's trying to be a part of is inbuilt into that book. So yeah, it doesn't make for that good a read today unless you're looking at it purely from the academic point of view. It's not an easy read because it's a fairly slim work. It's about 50 pages, but you would finish it and ask what's his point, but because there's no real point at
It's almost a semantic point.
Yeah. He's one of the first guys to say that Hindus are a nation, something that the Muslim League would say with much more vehemence later. But he's clear to his mind that we are a different nation from the Muslims. And even within that one nation of Hindus, if you, for example, are atheist and have no interest at all in anything that constitutes the Hindu faith, even then you are a respected member of that Hindu nation. Whereas,
and how he sort of seems to define this sort of, Hinduism as sort of a cultural construct or whatever, and why it excludes Muslims seems to be that one thing all Hindus have in common, Hindus, quote unquote, is that they bear allegiance to one motherland, which is, India, of course, doesn't exist, but that sort of area. And his claim is that Muslims don't, and therefore they're outside of it.
Yeah, so he says that there are three tests. One is that you come from this part of the world. So Hindus do, and Muslims do, and Sikhs do, and Christians do, and They all do, which is fine. And he says it's fine. The other is bonds of blood, which he says that we all share, including those who are not Hindus, because we come from a parentage and ancestry that's been here for a long time. So that's fine. That's the second one. The third one is the common culture bit, which you just spoke about, that Hindus have a common culture according to him. Raksha Bandhan, Diwali, such things are what constitute Hindu culture. To his mind, language, food, music, these are not cultural aspects. Certainly he doesn't write about them. He has no interest in them. I think this is something that carries through into Hindutva thinkers. There is no interest at all in what Hindu high culture is or what it should be. They don't care whether it exists at all. They don't write about it in any sense.
And a lot of it is very symbiotic with the Islamic high culture and so on, So
yeah, the thing is that music, it's not that easy to be able to separate it by faith, You've got in Europe, the high culture music, which is vocal, is almost entirely in a language that 90% of Europe doesn't speak. Italian. A lot of the music is composed by a group of people who are seen as mechanical and, the Germans, but they've got Mozart and they've got Beethoven and so on. It's not easy to say that this is this culture that we have and your culture is separate, and then, the only sort of intercourse that one culture has with another in the Savarkar view is through war, is through violence. That's not the way the world works,
And do you think it's not coincidental but telling that a lot of these Hindutva ideologues weren't actually into high culture? Because you imagine that people who are tuned into culture in that sense will be less likely to have such an exclusionary view of the world.
I hope what you're saying is right. It sounds nice. I don't know if that's the case though. It is certainly true that it's very difficult if you've properly studied Hindustani music to be a bigot. I'll give you an example. A lot of the compositions I used to learn how to sing Kirana Gharana. And about 90% of the compositions that are sung by that Gharana are the work of a man called Sadarang, who composed in the time of Muhammad Shah Rangila. Even if you've got something like Rag Shankara and it's an ode to Shiva, it's written by that man and he puts his name in it. So, and if you hear Bhimsen Joshi sing it, there's a lovely version of his shown on Doordarshan that's there on YouTube, where he's singing a Shankara and the name of the author, Niyamat Khan Sadarang, that's his name, is there in that song. All his songs, he would put his name in, So it's tough after that to be able to be very rigid in the way that one looks at either one's own faith or somebody else's. But as I said, you would find very little interest in any form of high culture of the Hindu, what we would look at as being Indian or Hindu high culture within the people who tend to push Hindutva. Whether it's food, music, anything, dance, it's not there.
And what is Savarkar's approach to caste?
One thing that becomes clear when one reads these people is all of them are Brahmin. So the three names that you took are all Brahmin. I'm not saying that there are no non-Brahmins who have contributed to this. I'm sure there are. But the corpus is primarily Brahmin. And so if we look at the RSS and the people who headed it, except for one man who is a Thakur, who was for a very brief period a Sarsanga Chalak, all of them are a Brahmin and most of them are Marathi Brahmins. So you have that narrowness built into the thinking, which has continued. And it is entirely absent of what we would look at as being multicultural Indian today, which we take for granted. You would have a figure like Shah Rukh Khan or whatever, and it's not really strange. But it was strange, I think, to them in the 20s when they were thinking this up. The levels of sort of intercourse between them and the other was very low. And there are mistakes, factual errors that they make in the book, including Savarkar, because he doesn't really know what he's talking about when he's writing about Islam.
Right. And what about caste? Like, there's an interesting quote by Savarkar, which I was unable to parse, but I'll just read it out for you, which is, quote, all that the caste system has done is to regulate his noble blood on lines believed, and on the whole rightly believed, by our saintly and patriotic lawgivers and kings, to contribute most to fertilize and enrich all that was barren and poor, without famishing and debasing all that was flourishing and nobly endowed. Stop quote. And this is both very verbose and he's not saying anything at all.
That particular paragraph needs to be unpicked, I think. So what he's saying is all of them support what is called varnashram, which is a division of society by caste. They don't have any problem with it. They think it's a good thing. And we can talk about Golwalkar and why he thought it was a great thing. But Savarkar believes that caste is beneficial. And he's, I think, to my mind, the first person to theorize this. He says that he has a problem with Buddhism. And he says that India became vulnerable because Buddhism took away caste from the subcontinent. And Afghanistan becomes Muslim because it remains Buddhist. But India, because it reverts to Hinduism and caste, is able to save itself from being fully Muslim. So he thinks that caste has a positive contribution to make here. He and Golwalkar both thought that restricting the gene pool was a good thing, and that Brahmins had something special which they could continue having if they bred amongst themselves, and they could pass on if they were to sort of impregnate the non-Brahmin. That's what that long line always says. Savarkar also thought that, I don't know if he thought this, but he certainly wrote it, that caste was not fully endogamous or rigid, that it was permissible in times before ours for people to marry up or down. And he has these Sanskritic words that he uses, anulom, and so on.
In fact, he has a line here where he says, quote, a Hindu marrying a Hindu may lose his caste, but not his Hindutva.
Yeah, so he was not a believer himself, so far as I know. He was not a particularly devout person. He was defined more by his antipathy than his faith. But I think he's the source of this argument that we have, he and maybe Vivekanand, that, caste is not all bad. There was a period in our history when you could sort of intermarry and then that was fine. And then it's just a division of labor. It's not really discrimination. I think these are views that the middle class today would hold. And I think they come to us in the middle class through these two men in the main. Golwalkar had a very outrageous view on this. And it's really surprising to me that though he's referred to as being the Guruji of the Sangh and so on, these things haven't been made as prominent as they should have been. Golwalkar says that caste is good because in the ideal caste-based society, access to money is completely separated from access to power, because the Vaishya deal with commerce and the Kshatriyas deal with the kingdom and authority, and that's great. So you don't have a mix.
So like a separation of power.
It's a separation of power. And he adds that there is this selfless community on top of them that has no skin in the game but is able to sort of guide and advise on how to run the whole state. And these are the Brahmins, obviously. And he says that this is what a good state should be like. And it's really strange to come upon him such a statement randomly in his work. He's written one book called A Bunch of Thoughts. And it's to be as old as one is and not have had known that this is what the Hindutva thought is for such a long period, to me is slightly strange. We don't have access in our schools to this kind of material, but we should.
And a related question I was saving for later, but we'll come back to Savarkar while I bring it up now, is that in a lot of the rhetoric of all of these guys, they actually talk about, hey, we are inclusive, we are not exclusionary. For example, the RSS being called the Rashtriya Sevak Sangh and not the Hindu Sevak Sangh, and so on. And a lot of that rhetoric actually percolates down to the present day. How much of that rhetoric do you think is a sort of genuine belief, and how much of it is strategic?
I would say most of it is the latter.
Right.
It's a strategy where you are trying to form. So to the RSS, the nation and the faith have never been separate. India is a nation, and India is a nation of Hindus, and Hindus are a nation. And so there was a debate on what to call the RSS. And Golwalkar says that at some point somebody suggested, Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh. And Hedgewar says that no, that there is no difference between India and Hindu. And why should we call ourselves Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh? Because then we will only be one of many. We don't represent Hindu, he says. We represent India in toto. And that is what, and that I think is the strategy.
I mean, that's a sentiment you see even to the present day, where if you're anti-Modi, you're anti-national.
Yeah, very true. If we've been surprised by the fact that this has become so externalized now, it's been there in their writing and their books for a long time.
And there's another quote of Savarkar I picked out which reminded me so much of the present times. So you just have to replace some words, which is, quote, "In times of conflict, nations do lose their balance of mind. And if the Persians or others once understood by the word Hindu a thief or black man alone, then let them remember that the word Mohammedan too was not always mentioned to denote any very enviable type of mankind by the Hindus either. To call a man a Musalman, or better still a Musanda, was worse than calling him a brute." Stop quote. And it's very interesting that even in current times, while he's speaking of words like Hindu and Musalman used as pejoratives, you find the same thing happening today when it comes to liberals.
Yeah, what you just read out is a fairly strange part of his book. I couldn't make sense of it. And I think that in the 20s, this might have been a big thing, or at least a big thing in the circles that he moved around in. So what Savarkar is trying to do is to show that the word Hindu is even if it is used as a word of abuse by the Muslims, and I can't think of any reason why it should be, we can give it back to you as well. Yeah, and how long that phase lasted in the part of the world that he was in, where the word Hindu was seen as a word of abuse, I don't know. But it takes up too much space in that work of his, yeah. And you're right, I think that the word liberal, the word secular also in Gujarat is seen as being colored in a particular way. So the word secular means pro-Muslim, and by default it means anti-Hindu.
I mean, one of the bizarre things I found was that earlier the BJP would criticize the Congress for being pseudo-secular, by which you would assume that if that is a criticism, then they are criticizing the Congress for not being truly secular, but being pseudo-secular. But how do you criticize people for being both pseudo-secular and secular, as if both things are bad?
Yeah, that the pseudo-secular debate is gone now. The one thing to be said about Hindutva, I think that it is honest. It owns its prejudices and doesn't hide in the way that Congress secularism did. In Madhya Pradesh, in Congress-run Madhya Pradesh, you could be charged under the NSA for the allegation of cow slaughter. So it's remarkable that they've just yanked the polity so quickly and so far that these things have become meaningless, pseudo-secular. But it is certainly true that in terms of terminology, the BJP doesn't back away from owning any of the things that you might accuse it of being. They will only justify it.
Right. And many of Savarkar's intellectual influences, or political influences rather, as various people have pointed out, came from Europe, from the fascists, from Mussolini and from Hitler. So almost as he was at pains to make the case that Hinduism was something very small and Hindutva was broader than that, what it seems was that it's the other way around. Hindutva was a subset where he used ideas in Hinduism to propagate a philosophy which wasn't really Indian to begin with, which was actually imported from there.
No, very true, very true. So he is writing in the period just after the unification of Italy, and he names, I think, either Mazzini or Garibaldi or maybe both in the book. His ideas are not those that have been sent down the ages. He's writing about something new. He's a subject in a Raj system with almost no power, sidelined and marginalized, but a smart man. And he's trying to make sense of the world. And he's trying to do it in a way that gives himself respect and the community and the people and the nation that he comes from a respect. But he does it in a way that sort of ultimately damages that same nation. Yeah.
Moving on from Savarkar now to Golwalkar. Tell me a little bit about Golwalkar.
He's the second Sarsanga Chalak of the RSS, which is formed in 1925 by this man in Nagpur, and who dies in 1940. And it is in the kind of mystical tradition which the Muslims also have, a Piro Murshid, which is what they call it. You tend to anoint your successor. And the story is that Golwalkar, who was fairly young, had translated a work into English. He was reasonably bilingual. I have no record or I have no access to his language in some, but it seems like he knew a fair bit of English. And he translates this work, which is titled We or Our Nationhood Defined. And that brings him into prominence for some reason. I don't know what it is. And on dying, to the surprise of many, he is made the head of the RSS on the dying of the first head. So this is 1940. Then he goes through partition. He's a fairly young man then. He's not particularly old. He's just in his late 30s. And he dies in 73. So he's headed the RSS from a period which was before independence, through the violence of partition, the constitution, through the wars with China and with Pakistan, and of course the partition of Pakistan later in 71, 72, and then he dies the year after that. So he's seen a fair bit. He's also the man who actually makes it a national organization. He's able to reduce the idea of the Shakha down to a simple form, very basic activity, raising the flag, wearing shorts if you have the shorts, coming and doing your prayers and playing kabaddi, playing games with sticks, and you go back after that. There's nothing else. There's no sort of intellectual content. But he's figured out that this is an easy thing to replicate. And it's true. It's the largest non-governmental organization in the world. It's the most powerful non-governmental organization, or at least one of them in the democratic world. I think the power that people ascribe to things like AIPAC or the NRA in the US, the RSS is much more powerful than any of those groups. I think that's his doing. He takes the idea of the individual Marathi Brahmin who is willing to take up this work in parts of the country whose language he doesn't speak, Gujarat, sets up shop there in one room, doesn't marry, gives himself up to this work. What is this work? Conducting the Shakha in the morning, and then for the rest of the day doing whatever it is that they wish to do. But making a life out of this, very few people can do this. They still do it. You have people from the RSS that run single teacher schools across the Adivasi belt, where they're bringing people out of what they think as being a animism and into a more a Puranic faith. So he formulates this sort of easily replicable model, and he does it. So very soon you've got hundreds of these shakhas opening all over the country. 10 years after he takes over the RSS, we have a constitution. 2 years after that, we have the first election. And the Janasangh is formed. So then he supplies material to the party in terms of cadre, in terms of people who can stand. Vajpayee is one. Madhwani is another who come out of that. Shekhawat is a third. And he's there behind all of this, running the shakhas, making sure that the organization is continuously built and built to the end that he thought it was right. I think the shakha should be seen in a particular light. Why do they do exercises that require training with lathis. Who are they training to fight against? Are they going to fight the Chinese at the border? No, that's not. They're going to fight other Indians. That's what the Shakha does. In a riot, the Shakha is the locus of the violence. It's the one place where the neighborhood young men who've trained in the physical stuff, who know one another and can bond and can trust one another, can take a collective action that the individual so-called cowardly Hindu doesn't. And he does a very good job of it. The RSS can overwhelm the security apparatus of the average Indian city very easily, as we've seen in Gujarat.
So all the memes that were floating around after Pulwama, that, the RSS should send people with their sticks to fight at the border, actually misplaced, because the idea is not that they're going to fight Pakistan or China.
No. Yeah. Well, to them, I think Pakistan is just an extension of the Indian Muslim. I don't think they see it in a way that most other Indians would. You would see it as a foreign country. You would sense some sort of brotherhood in terms of the food being the same and the music being the same, and But it's as different to somebody from Gujarat as Tamil Nadu would be, or whatever. It's a different place, and it is separated also by government. So it would be properly foreign. For them, it's not that way. I think they would see the Muslim in Gulbarga as being identical to the one in Lahore. It's the same thing. It's you're on my land and you don't belong in my country. If you do belong, it is on sufferance. I think that they would say that okay, it's fine, but whoever we is, has a privilege and rights that you don't.
And the way you describe it sounds almost that Golwalkar was a management and strategic genius of sorts, that he figured out that this was a way to grow the organization, build feeling of community and brotherhood and all of those things. But did these things just happen, or did he actually plan them that way?
I'm not sure what the pre-Golwalkar RSS looked like. Mr. Modi, in his very fawning a biographical sketch of Golwalkar, recounts this sort of interview that Golwalkar has with somebody, and that person says, "Oh, why are you just calling people over and doing this, simple childish stuff like playing games and all?" And Golwalkar says to him that we are masters of the science of organization. He uses the words in English, according to Mr. Modi, and I think that certainly Mr. Modi sees him in that light, that he is somebody who was able to create a format that, especially in urban India, was easy to replicate, and which he did replicate. To be fair, most of the expansion of the RSS from being hundreds across India to being in the tens of thousands happened much after his death. It happened in the 80s and 90s. And
despite all this, like you said, that there wasn't much intellectual content coming from Golwalkar. Like in your notes, there's a line I'll quote on Golwalkar, where you say, quote, "He sets great store by feeling and emotion, because thinking takes away from the strong sense of identity and communitarianism. That is his passion." Stop quote.
Yeah, there is no... So if you think of an ideology, it would be a set of rules or principles that have something basic that is underlying, that you're trying to reach at something that is large. There's nothing like that in the writing, certainly of Golwalkar. And in none of the Hindutva ideologues will you find anything that even approaches an ideology. It's quite basic. They will talk very lightly of Greek thought, or... So... Upadhyay says that there are that modern Western systems, and he says that the three main ones are nationalism, democracy, and socialism, are in some way not whole, and people in the West feel insecure because of this lack of sort of wholesomeness. And he says the reason is that they are not able to satisfy the four aspects of human being. And he says that these four aspects are body, mind, intellect, and soul. How mind is different from the intellect, he doesn't explain, and what soul is, he doesn't say. Golwalkar talks about the fact that, okay, we are quite bad at science, fine, but Hindus are masters of the science of spirit. What does that mean? What does spirit mean? Does he mean it in the sense of sort of he and both Upadhyay, do they both mean it in the sense of the transmigration of souls and things like that? You don't know, because they don't really expand. They just assume that the reader will nod his head and say, oh yeah, there are 4 parts to the human being: body, mind, intellect and soul, and that Hindus are they're the masters of the science of spirit. And what is the justification that Golwalkar gives for this? He says that, well, Jesus only saw Satan, and Muhammad only met Gabriel. It is the Hindu saints that actually saw God and witnessed God and knew about his sort of attributes. But from there to have like an objective discussion is not easy, because you're talking to somebody who believes in that sort of thing. So it's quite vacuous in many ways. It's quite disappointing, because if you see some of the more militaristic stuff that the other faiths have done, there is a fair amount of intellectual rigor there. There is none here. It's nothing that.
There's a lot of what seems to be the waffling you find in self-help books. And also a lot of sort of the way Golwalkar seems to rouse his followers is not by talking about Hindutva itself, but by the threats that it faces from outside, for example.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about that.
Well, threat mostly inside. So the fact is that the enemy is already within us and needs to be sorted. So I think that is the one thing that is constant to all of these people who wrote about the subject, that the enemy is primarily the Indian Muslim, who needs to be fixed, needs to be put in their place. But there's too many of them, we don't know what to do with them. But we will show that we are not going to be the kind of nation we were 1,000 years ago. That we were the embodiment of the ideal spirit. Caste was very good, and we had these great kings, and then these people came and they conquered us. The idea of slavery and being subjects over 1,000 years runs very strongly through this. There is a strong sense of belief that in some way what Modi represents today is the breaking out from that slavery, both the period of direct rule by foreigners and by those that they left behind.
And this is again a question I was saving for the end, but since it's come up now, I'll ask it anyway. And something I wonder about, which is that there is this sense of grievance and the humiliation of the past and so on and so forth. And some of it isn't even true. It's just made up. But the point is that this is the sort of history that these guys invoke to rouse people to passion. But the common person, like growing up in the India that you are, where Hindus are the majority and Brahmins especially are incredibly privileged, where do they get this historic sense of humiliation from? It's not that they live amid history and amid the ruins or anything like that. Why does it rouse them to such passion that a temple was broken so many years ago, or, the Muslims ruled us in centuries, of which there is really no sign today?
Some would say that this is the narrative that the British constructed and left behind, that the first schools in Gujarat only come in the 1850s. So Elphinstone builds them, which is only, 170 years ago, right? So before that, you don't have any form of organized teaching. So when do you come into group think? When do you have a sense of your nationhood? Fairly recently. As a Gujarati, I'd say that my own sense of bigotry and prejudice comes out of a popular history of 4 volumes written by K.M. Munshi on Somnath. And even though you might not know much about histories, particularly in the sense of dates and such things, you will have had a sense of Somnath in Gujarat purely through these 4 fairly recent novels. And I think that a lot of it might be that it's the fact that it's a fairly recently educated nation. At the turn of the 20th century, 4% of India was illiterate. I mean, it's quite remarkable to think of that. It's not that long ago, or just 119 years. And secondly, that you're living cheek by jowl with a very large community, which doesn't share what you think are the pillars of your own faith. vegetarianism or whatever else. So yeah, but I don't know for sure. I haven't thought about that. This is the first time that I'm actually confronted. Why do they feel this? I really don't know.
Because it also strikes me that, a lot of people who are born Hindu aren't reading these books. For example, the ones you point out about Somnath, they're not surrounded by signs of that humiliation. So part of the reason that these histories persist or these grievances persist must be not only because they're being brainwashed into it, but because they need these to validate something else. Maybe there's an innate bigotry and they need to build this backstory to validate that. Is that
possible? I know for sure that the resistance of the Indian Muslim to the monopolization of power by the Hindus under Congress is not seen sympathetically at all by most Hindus. So for us, when we are taught in school, Jinnah's the villain, and if you're sort of Hindutva minded, then the Congress got conned or they were part of the game itself. But the idea that there was a legitimate claim to a share in power is not seen sympathetically. Today you could give data to the average Indian middle class person and say that the last person from Gujarat who is Muslim, who was elected to the Lok Sabha, came in 1985. And this is a community that has produced Premji, that has produced Khurakiwala, that has produced Jinnah. Ahmed Patel, last one in 85, not a single person from the UP today has no Muslim in the Lok Sabha. The BJP of the 1100 or 1200 legislators they have nationally have 4 Muslims. Does this make people uncomfortable? I would say no. They're okay with it. But in such a society, it's easy to see why you can demonize a community and feel no sympathy for it and have no empathy for the fact that you've marginalized them totally from power. And any demand that they might make to share power would be seen in negative terms. That you're trying to break up my country or like whatever else. I think there is so I don't know what the wellspring is, where it comes from for people in the 20s, but certainly after 47, partition would be one great trigger for this hatred.
And, a tangential question here, which is that if we look at all the other parties like the Congress and so on, it's easy to say that they are basically election winning machines and there's no core philosophy to them. And at least when it comes to the BJP, there is some kind of, however badly formulated, there are some core philosophical beliefs. But where that seems to come under challenge is when you look at how they won 2014. For example, someone I had on my show a few months ago was Prashant Jha, who wrote the book about how the BJP won. And he points out about how Amit Shah went along building those sort of caste coalitions. And so very early on in UP, for example, they figure out, okay, we are not getting the Muslim vote. So obviously they won't nominate someone there. But then among the OBCs, they know that there are resentments among the non-Yadav OBCs, so they bring them in. Among the non-Jatav Dalits against Mayawati, so they try to bring them into the fold, and he tries to bring a coalition like that. And at a certain point, Jha in his book quotes the Dalit scholar as saying that BJP in some places is actually the Dalit party, because they're not only getting Dalit office bearers, but they're building Dalit temples and so on, and actually investing in the community. And my question here is not of how genuine that is or whatever. It's obviously driven by political imperatives. But then with the BJP, there is, again, and I'm just thinking aloud, that there is then that dissonance between what seems to be a guiding philosophy, which is not an inclusive guiding philosophy on one hand, and on the other hand, the imperatives of winning elections, which typically would make parties sociopathic in the sense that they don't really then have any core beliefs. They'll just do whatever it takes to win votes.
The sort of really interesting thing about the BJP's attitude to caste is that it has not allowed to any large extent what its ideologues have written into practice. As long as you are vaguely okay with the fact that they felt that caste was a good thing and so on, it doesn't really matter that you are not yourself a Brahmin. You can become the leader of India if you're not a Brahmin, but you have to be Brahminical. I think that's what the rules say. So Mr. Modi comes from a community that is meat eating.
But then Savarkar and Golwalkar would use that to say that, see, inclusive, we mean Hinduism is a way of life and not as...
Indeed. Yeah. They have that space. They also have... there is a brotherhood. There is a sense that when two Swayamsevaks meet, that there is a shared idea of this country. There is a shared idea of who the enemy is. There's a shared idea of what the problems are. And I think that has held them together and given them a kind of network which no other party has and no other party can have. Outside of the Jati, Biradari networks that most parties run on in the north, for example, the BJP has a kind of underlying layer, especially in towns and cities, which holds the whole project together.
Going back to Golwalkar now, as you pointed out, a few years after he becomes the head of the RSS, you have partition and all of that. And I noticed one interesting fact about Golwalkar was that he used to make Sanskrit the national language, much as, Urdu became the national language there. To what extent is the Pakistan project actually a model or an inspiration for the Hindutva leading thinkers to do a Hindu version of that?
I don't know. Pakistan's origins are fairly are from the modernist point of view. They are not antediluvian. So the person who coined the word Pakistan was in London. Allama Iqbal, who thought of this kind of utopia in northwest India where people would reformulate Islam and make it modern, was not a traditionalist at all. So you would think of them as being extreme. They were very, very advanced in the way that they were thinking. That's not the Hindutva project. The Hindutva project is most comfortable looking back rather than looking in front. That the stronger emotions are about the defeats of the past and so on. So I don't know whether it was a model. I do know that he wanted Sanskrit in some sense to be elevated, but he also felt that till such time as everybody learnt it, it was okay to use Hindi. Then, of course, it ran into trouble because of the revolution in the south and the rebellion, I should say, and then he would have withdrawn the vehemence. But for most of the 60s and 70s, the RSS had very little power. The Janasangh, the previous version of the BJP, had about 2.5% of the vote in Gujarat for most of the 70s. Till Babri happens, they are a very marginal power. So even though they might have felt it strongly, and even if they might have externalized things like we should make Sanskrit the language of the country, they had very little power or means to be able to either amplify their view or certainly to be able to impose it.
So was Babri something that was inevitable as a trigger of a change that was coming, or was it an episode that just happened to make this whole thing explode and it wouldn't have otherwise?
I would recommend a book written by two men both called Jha, I think, to your listeners on the Babri issue. It was festering, so its history predates independence, a controversy, and that it's given fresh life in the 80s. But I believe that Hindutva would have found its sureness of foot elsewhere if it had not been for Babri. Babri was very important. It gave them a momentum as a political party which they would never have been able to find otherwise. But we should also remember that the momentum and the expansion of the party happens primarily also through civic violence. When the BJP participates in some way in the murder of the Muslims of this country, it is able to expand itself. In the recent phase, the full-blown riot has been replaced with a series of sort of episodes, lynchings or things like what happened in UP. But it is not just the symbolic aspect of the movement. I think the campaign is also built on mobilizing people, validating the violence that they perpetrate, and they have no shame in being able to accept that fact.
I've taken up a lot of your time, so I think we'll skip talking about Upadhyay, and I'll just recommend my listeners to read your book when it comes out. But a few broader questions. Now, the term Hindu Rashtra, obviously, as you pointed out, was coined by Hegdewar. Like, he met Savarkar in 25 and later that year formed the RSS, and instead of Hindutva, he used the term Hindu Rashtra, I mean, whether he coined it or not. Now, we are talking about the Hindu Rashtra today, and you're writing this book because of political events, what has happened since 2014 and the new dominance of the BJP sort of as a central pole of Indian politics. But my question is, does the Hindu Rashtra exist outside of politics? Is it primarily a culture thing, and is the politics just one inevitable outcrop of that?
I think politics amplifies it a lot. It does exist outside of politics. Maybe it's not as pronounced as it is. Maybe if it were not molested by politics, it would remain dormant. It does exist. It is there. I think that the idea, if it were not, it would not be the case that we are the only country in South Asia that is not majoritarian by law or has tried to be at some point. There is something about this part of the world where might is right. If there's more of you than the other, or the people that you think of as being the other.
But also the fact that we didn't give into majoritarianism could be a combination of circumstance, that we had the people we had framing the constitution and inertia.
Maybe, yeah, that's a good explanation. But I think that we would struggle even more than the Muslims of Pakistan in trying to find what that right a projection of faith onto law is. It would be very difficult.
So I'll ask you to expand on that now. You said at the start of the episode that there can be no such thing as a Hindutva constitution. Why?
After Ram comes back from Ayodhya, there is a turmoil in the court, and there is a Brahmin who comes to him with his son who's dead, and this son is flawless. He's not done a thing wrong in his life. He's only 14. And the court tries to figure out why he's died. And the high priests say that it's because of an evil in the world. And what is this evil? It is that a Shudra is performing penance by trying to, can't be the word read because he can't read, but he's speaking out words from the Veda, which he's not supposed to. Ram goes and beheads him. This is the name of the Shudra is Shambhuka. This is in the Valmiki Ramayana. That's what the basis of the faith is caste. You might say, no, it is an innovation. It's not the case. But if you open your eyes and look at the society, the distinction between Dalit and Brahmin is quite clear. The access is quite clear. The history of India, the modern history of India in terms of access to temples is not that old. What is it that we use from that faith to be able to make India a proper Hindu Rashtra? We can discriminate against minorities. That's what most of these states in South Asia have sort of ended up doing. But what part of the faith can we actually implement to make it a Hindu Rashtra for Hindus? You can have a Hindu Rashtra for Muslims. You can't stand for the PM. Pakistan discriminated through law. We've done it through a practice. It's impossible to conceive of a Muslim becoming the PM of this country. Maybe in a coalition, but even that would be difficult. What part of the Hindu faith can we reduce and say that this is something that is applicable to modernity that's missing right now that will make us more pious? I think that fundamentally that is the question. For the Pakistanis, it became things like riba. So Jesus says that he chucks the money changers, they're called, out of the temple. And usury becomes a bad word in the Semitic faiths. So for centuries, the Jews have a monopoly in Europe on access to capital. They are the only ones who can charge interest. Though Islam is much closer to Judaism than it is to Christianity, and it brings back indeed into the Semitic faiths the ideas of circumcision and pork and things like that. From Christianity, they take the idea that usury is a sin. The problem is that there's no modern banking system in the 7th century. But all three of Pakistan's constitutions has say in writing that the state shall try to eliminate riba. What happens is that the Supreme Court in 1999 and in 2000 abolished interest. It passed an order saying interest henceforth is abolished. But the modern economy will collapse. There is no replacement. What is the justification? That if we do this, barakat hogi, we'll get the blessings from God because we are doing this pious thing. That's not how modern states work. Pakistan, there are 5 pillars of Islam. Shahada, Som, Salah, Zakat, Hajj. So, let's take fasting. In Dubai, like in many of the Gulf states in Ramzan, they shut, restaurants have to be shut in the period of Ramzan till dusk. And that maybe makes the state a little more pious. You can actually implement that. You're trying to enforce your faith onto law. That's one way of doing it. You can do that with, Pakistan tried to do that with zakat. So that is alms or a tax. So under Zia, what they say is, okay, on the 1st of Ramzan, we will deduct 2.5% from all the bank deposits that are there, except for non-Sunnis. So because the Shia have their own clergy and they give their own money to them and so on, what started happening was Sunnis started declaring themselves Shia to not have the money deducted from their accounts, and then they had to water down that law.
Which shows humans will game anything, even religion.
Indeed, I'm saying it's not possible to take a set of philosophical ideas, constructs, precepts, faith, belief type thing and apply it to the modern world in the misplaced thinking that this will in some way improve your country. And therefore, Hindu Rashtra, for it to become Hindu and non-discriminatory. I can completely understand the fact that when we say Hindu Rashtra, we'll say we'll kick the Muslims out. They can go to Pakistan. They can't eat beef. They have to give us their mosque. They have to give us their constitutional autonomy in Kashmir. They have to surrender their personal law. All that is fine. What does Hindu Rashtra offer Hindus? I think that is the problem. The question is that it doesn't have anything inside the faith that can be imposed. And that's a good thing in the way that Islam was able to impose, say, prayer or fasting or, the abolition of interest. That's what makes it impossible, but that also brings the focus entirely onto minorities and discrimination. The only way that Hindutva can express itself is in negative terms. It cannot express itself in positive terms. The 3 primary demands of a political Hindutva is, surrender your mosque, surrender your personal law, surrender your constitutional autonomy in Kashmir. There is nothing positive that it demands that will create a new or a vibrant nation.
And yet it has such momentum in our electoral politics and in our culture. So is it that people are then so full of hate and bigotry that this is so appealing to them?
I think two things. I think that we should examine what you've just said. If you feel disturbed and I feel disturbed and many of us feel disturbed with the way that the beef lynching is a new phenomenon. We have introduced it to our country. It didn't exist. Just like the blasphemy lynchings did not exist in Pakistan till the law came to be, till Maharashtra and Haryana did not act on the law in late 2014 or 2015, and the PM had not expressed himself strongly. We did not have the phenomenon of lynching on the issue of beef. This is new. We have gifted it to ourselves, and I think that we should ask ourselves, why don't more Indians recoil from this? I don't know the answer to it. But having said that, it is also the case that the BJP is a normal political party in India with a base that in large measure is based on caste and based on divisions at the local level and not particularly on any kind of ideology.
So I'm again thinking aloud here, trying to think about possibilities for why we don't recoil from this. And one thing that I've kind of believed is that, look, all of us contain multitudes, and therefore just as the Hindu guy who's a bigot and who supports this narrative and who, wants to see a Hindu Rashtra. But there are other facets of him beyond this bigotry. He also wants to be prosperous. He also wants to go to a concert. He also wants to do whatever. And there just aren't enough narratives appealing to the better angels of the nature, as you might say. So is it then the case that this is also a cultural failure on the part of others to create those narratives, and a political failure on the part of other political parties to come up with appealing narratives that can counter the Hindutva narrative?
I don't know, but I think that you are onto something when you say what you just did, that there is an absence of narrative to the side of the kind of faith-based, hate-based stuff that is appealing to large numbers of people. I certainly don't see it. Maybe it's there and I don't see it. You could be in India and be reading the newspaper and not seeing many things, and that's normally. It's a very large place. But to the extent that there is a non-hate based narrative, even that seems to me to be controlled by the BJP. The idea of modernity through nationalism, the idea of non-dynastic politics, the idea of honesty in politics. A lot of that seems to be owned by the BJP, especially since Modi. And it might well be that it's a failure of the other side to put forward something that is appealing. But I find it disturbing that more people are not upset by the morning newspaper. It seems to me to be strange.
On that note, I've taken enough of your time. I'll ask you one final question, which I usually ask my guests on whatever the subject we're talking about is, which is I ask them what makes them hope and what makes them despair, but I'll be a little more specific. I'll say that, number one, what is at stake in these elections? And number two, within a 10-year window of time, the next 10 years, what is your best case scenario for India and what is your worst case scenario?
There's this funny line. There's this old poet who's asked, कि यूं ही चलता रहा तो क्या होगा? So he says, डर तो इस बात का है कि कुछ भी नहीं होगा, यूं ही चलता रहेगा. So I think that our fear is not that we will deteriorate into something worse, but the fact that we are okay with how bad it is now.
That what has been normalized now would be the worst case scenario.
Indeed. This is a weird country. You've got violence in Kashmir, including the deaths of the armed forces, higher in 2018 than in 2014, and higher progressively so. To claim deterrence or to claim a hard military posture in the face of data, to me, is astonishing. I mean, you slapped me and I kicked you to whatever end. But the damage here done to me and my own is real. But it doesn't seem to really affect the narrative in the larger media space. We are seen as doing some great things, So it's bad enough as it is. I hope it doesn't get worse. I think we have enough within our societies, and I think that we have more than one, to offer resistance. I don't think that we are all the same as Gujarat. I think Gujarat is special in many ways, in good ways, in many ways in really bad ones. But I don't think that the rest of the country is like that at all.
So what makes you despair is that it's more of the same?
Yeah, I think it's not going away. I think that we have to live with this for a very long time. It doesn't matter who wins in 2019. I think the idea that we have normalized violence against individuals who are vulnerable, the idea that we can marginalize people entirely, a community which has 160-70 million people out of our legislatures, and it's okay. To me, that is unacceptable, but it seems to be fine for most of us, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
On that hopeful note, Aakar, thanks so much for coming on the Scene and the Unseen. You were really insightful. I learned a lot. If you enjoyed listening to the show, do go directly to the source and read the books Aakar and I spoke about by Savarkar, Golwalkar and Deendayal Upadhyay, which are linked from the show notes. Both Aakar and I could be biased against Hindutva, so please do make up your own mind. You can follow Aakar's columns online by putting a Google alert for him or just searching for his name on Google News. He isn't too active on social media, which is a smart decision. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AmitVarma. The Scene and the Unseen is supported supported by the Takshashila Institution, an independent center for research in education and public policy. You can browse all our past episodes at seenunseen.in and thinkpragati.com. Thank you for listening.
Hey, this is Shidaditya.
And I'm Amit Doshi.
And we host Shunya One.
It's a really fun podcast where we talk to some of the best entrepreneurs in the country.
Yes, talking about everything from their startup challenges to what they're building and all the future of technologies right here.
So catch us on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you listen to your podcast from.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have. Paisa Vaisa is brought to you by Paytm Money.